like to have my guests introduce themselves, just talk a little bit about your background and expertise.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the nature of this conversation isn't supposed to be biographical, so I'll do my best to keep it concise. But my research interests really do kind of align and overlap with my professional experience and my educational journey. So, my research interest is primarily in occupational socialization, which explores the agents and the facilitators and the reasons why a person chooses their career, how they're prepared to perform that career, and then ultimately when they're out in their professional setting, how they're doing the job. In my specific area of occupational socialization theory research is in primarily it's in physical education, health education, and also in coaching. But of course, that theory could be applied to include other areas of the kinesiology and health and human performance discipline. I started my career through kinesiology. I'm an academic now, I'm a professor, but I started as a soccer coach and a teacher of a character development program in an after-school program in Arlington, Texas, at a school that had unique challenges related to sociocultural disadvantages, poverty, and I worked with students that were at risk of dropping out, at risk of joining gangs, at risk of getting pregnant, using drugs, things like that. So I taught a character development class, and I coached soccer, and I taught PE, and a handful of other things. I was there for 5 years. I started that when I was a sophomore in college. Wrong. I was a freshman in college. I was 19. It was my second semester in college. So I was there for 5 years, and little did the kids know that I was a kid myself, just trying to figure out how to be responsible and how to stay just one step ahead of them on organization and time management, all that type of stuff I was talking to them about. I was really learning through it as well at the same time. Worked with really phenomenal people, motivated people, enthusiastic people, and that rubbed off on me in a really good way. And so I simultaneously was getting my undergrad degree in sport pedagogy, pedagogical kinesiology, to be a PE teacher and a coach, and also maybe teach science. That was something that was interesting to me. I got a master's degree in exercise science with a focus in strength and conditioning. But really my time at that junior high, working with those kids, that was really meaningful to me. So I knew I wanted to be in the education area in some capacity. I was implored by some of my mentors to pursue a doctorate. I think that they saw some skill set in me or some interest, and that was a really good call for me. So I went to the University of Alabama to get a doctorate in sport pedagogy. So my master's is in strength and conditioning, so the really hard science side of kinesiology. My doctorate is in sport pedagogy, exploring the arts and science and the social and political milieu of education, and so where those worlds kind of collide. So you could say I've got a foot in each camp, the soft side and the hard side of kinesiology. It was at the University of Alabama I met scholars who really excelled and who are just brilliant academic minds and brilliant researchers, and their focus was in occupational and is in occupational socialization theory. So that's where I learned about that theoretical lens, and that's where I learned to use qualitative research to explore some of those questions about how we're preparing future health educators, PE teachers, and coaches. And now I'm in my second semester at York College, which is a member of the CUNY system, the City University of New York system. So a pretty great academic institution is CUNY, and I'm very pleased to be at York College in New York. It's funny doing the research at all these different places: Texas, Alabama, Iowa, and now New York. So many of those theoretical concepts and constructs that exist in occupational socialization theory, they're present in all of these places, but of course, there's a little different flavor. Working with urban educators in the urban setting is, of course, very different than rural Iowa, as you could imagine. So I think it's important that we apply the theory and research and some of the things that we explore in interpretive qualitative research. We've got to do it in multiple settings so that we have a more broad understanding of the mechanisms that facilitate some of our constructed understandings.
So it sounds like your career really spans a lot of different aspects of the culture of sports that we have here. We have the performance aspect, of course, but then also there's the social aspect and just the physical aspect that you study. And obviously sports are a huge part of our culture here in America, especially. And I think a lot of people probably view them through the lens of entertainment. And there's a lot of excitement and drama in sports, and they're absolutely great for that. But as you were talking a little bit about, is that there's a lot of other social, psychological, physiological benefits to participating in sports as well. It's not just the entertainment part. And
Yeah.
so that's really what I want to focus this part of the discussion on then, is just to what do we value in sports, and how do we find ways to get people to participate and to learn and to compete and to get all these benefits.
You hit on two concepts that are really, really important to distinguish from one another. There's playing sports, and then there's watching sports. So really, it's a simple question: why do we play sports? But that's a really, really big question. And of course, it's contextually bound, and it's interpersonally dependent on people's individuality. So the answer to that would be different depending on who you asked. Obviously, why do you specifically play sports? But that's a much easier question to answer than why do we watch sports? Why do we play sports? Certainly at the youth level, children don't have a ton of personal agency, and their parents are making a lot of decisions for them. So it could be that sports are something the parents value. Sports have community value and cultural value, respective of where that community and culture resides. Certain sports trace back to national origin and ethnicity, might even have religious or spiritual implications. So there could be a lot of familial, cultural reasons that a person participates in sport once they have that agency to choose for themselves. But these questions have been asked from participants at the high school level and college level. Why do you play sports a lot? Do it because it was culturally or community valued. So there was a social group involved. Being a part of something bigger than themselves is a common answer for why you play sports. Some people simply want exercise because their friends play, because it was something to do, because their parents wanted them to be preoccupied with practice time Monday through Friday, games on Saturday, so that there was an organization to their child's life. So sport, for some reason, or I should say for a lot of reasons, are helping to organize and facilitate a person's social development. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because that's where youth sports and professional sports and college sports are really apples and oranges. We have this belief that sports builds character, and that can be true if the agents and facilitators and the leadership, the key leadership figures, are using sports to those ends. But the truth is, no matter what the sport is, whether it's golf, soccer, tennis, or football, the sport is neutral in a vacuum. There's rules, there's a playing field, and you execute the sport neutrally in a vacuum. But we in society, and from leadership perspectives, we influence the sport. And so I've always told my students who are going on to be athletics coaches and beyond, is you will dictate the ethical application of the rules. Manipulating the rules, sportsmanship and gamesmanship are two opposite things, right? So I think of sports as a net neutral. It's really dependent on who the leaders and facilitators of that sport are as to whether or not character actually will be developed in the positive way that we want it to be, or if the sports will just become another avenue for interruption of social normative behavior that we try to distance from. So in the professional setting, it's so different because there's so much incentive to win, and the incentive to win is stronger than most people's willpower. So it's really, really hard to talk about sporting as a vessel for character development in the professional context, because we're typically talking about an environment that's been constructed that's just so radically different than the everyday environment that you or I might be in sport. I can't rationalize the tens of millions of dollars that are at stake, whether I make this free throw or not, whether I foul on that layup or not, whether I'm going to tug the referee on the shoulder and say, hey, I stepped out of bounds and you missed it. I'm going to call my own mistake there. So it's kind of apples and oranges. So when we talk about sport and the educational component of sport, somewhere after high school, that line becomes so blurred that we're talking about two different things. if you read the mission statements of Division One, two, and three college athletics, they all point towards the mission of athletics programs in higher education as being something bigger than the game itself. I throw a little skepticism at that because I don't know if you're a college basketball fan, but March Madness is going on right now, men's and women's college basketball tournaments. And I see a lot of money. I see a lot of attention. I see a lot of aggression from spectators. And it really doesn't look like that sport in that context is doing what we in society say sport is and ought to be, which is a character building vessel. So somewhere after high school, I think when money gets introduced, it's no longer the thing we wanted it to be.
That was my perspective as well, and kind of the inspiration I had for wanting to talk to you, because I don't follow sports too much at like the professional or these like money making levels, and I participated, all the way up through. I still do pickup sports and some organized sports, and you distinguished with two words. You use gamemanship versus sportsmanship, and kind of contrasted those, especially when there's other I guess stakes on the line. We drill down just a little bit again on that distinction on what you think of as sportsmanship, and then how it contrasts in your mind with that gamesmanship.
Sportsmanship, and forgive me, maybe the appropriate term is sportspersonship. I toggle back and forth. Obviously, I want to be respectful to the appropriate vernacular, but traditionally known as sportsmanship, that's ethical and moral decision making. That's applying yourself to the rules that are established so that the game is fair. Because if the game is not fair, the game has no meaning, right? You could win the game, but you know that if you didn't do it straight up, then I don't know how valuable that victory really is, at least in a person that might be a reflective person that's considering, why did I play that game in the first place, right? And really, this goes back even further to why you were playing the game in the first place. In youth sports, we talk about there being really three different reasons we want youth to play sports if we believe that sports are a good thing: to socially develop, to develop social skills, to develop personal responsibility, to play in the sandbox with goal setting and teamwork and communication, right? The social development of sport. There's also the physical and psychomotor development of sport, believing that playing sport is good for the physical body, physical health. That makes sense. And then the third reason is winning. And we put a lot of value in society on winning, perhaps more so. When polled, the research would suggest that when polled, the average US citizen says that social development is the most important thing that we should be striving for in youth sport. That's just what we say. When we see it in practice, clearly winning is what is valued the most. So it's sort of a cultural thing. Winning is viewed as very, very important. When winning is the priority, and certainly when it's the only priority, sportsmanship tends to be lost. It's filtered out. It's a byproduct, really, of social development, right? So if a person is playing sport and coaching sport and participating in sport with social development as a priority, sportsmanship tends to be elevated. And then gamesmanship, for your listeners and viewers, gamesmanship is discussed as just being good at playing the game and skirting the rules a little bit, where there's gray area. Maybe denying that the ball hit off your leg before it went out of bounds. Maybe giving that golf ball just the slightest nudge with your heel so you improve your lie, right? And in some cases, that's blatantly cheating, right? Lying and cheating. In some cases, it's not so obvious, it's not so clear. So in those gray areas, they call that gamesmanship. But a person that's wanting to play the sport with sportsmanship in fidelity to social development would probably look at gamesmanship in most situations and define that as cheating. So obviously, that's why we have referees, umpires, and judges, right? There'd be no need for those positions if we were all playing the sport in its, this might do some eye rolling, but in its purest form.
Yeah, I think that those gray areas often are what people like about the sports, is that there's some wiggle room, there's some interesting stories and character to the sport in that gray area.
Yeah, and that's where some of the drama is. And you used the word drama earlier, and that's really that's a great word to describe what sport is. It's almost manufactured drama for entertainment value. I think you use the word entertainment as well. Some social theorists out there have asked, why are we so into sports as spectators? Because the reasons, like I said earlier, the reasons we play sports are actually kind of easier to get to. It's sort of intuitive to be with friends, to get some exercise. My parents made me, right? Why do we watch sports? Honestly, I'm a huge sports fan, probably to a fault. And I'm watching March Madness, the college basketball tournaments, and I'm watching, I'm 34. So to me, they're kids. They're 20 years old. I know they're not kids, but I'm watching these kids play a game over which I have absolutely no influence whatsoever. It
Influence
doesn't make a
or
lot of sense.
stakes. You probably don't know these kids anymore, or
Oh my gosh, no, there came a point where as a fan of sports, I would watch college football or college basketball and be like, oh wow, I'm older than that guy. That's trippy to think about that that's a kid to me now. And now it's the same in the pros. A 34-year-old basketball or football player is ancient. So now it's like these to me, from my perspective, they're kids playing a game over which I have no influence. So why am I so into it? And some social theorists have suggested or that we're kind of just tribalistic by nature, human beings. We wrap ourselves in the flag and every 4 years and root our hardest for swimming during the Olympics. And most of us don't really pay attention to Olympics for most. So whenever you can attach some in-group, out-group, tribalistic component to it, we tend to care a little bit more on us versus them. And I'm not so sure that's healthy. But also, other social theorists have suggested that it's an outlet for aggression and it's manufactured drama. We're not warring tribes anymore. So there must be something innate within us that's fundamental that needs an outlet for aggression and to manufacture drama. So sport has almost replaced the gladiator rings, which has replaced warfare and combat from the generations that predated it. So it's almost like some residual from some type of aggressive tendency that we just have innately. Anyways, that's sort of out there being discussed.
yeah, I have to find a side to root for in order for me to care about watching
Yeah,
a game.
to give it meaning.
Yeah,
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 otherwise it doesn't have much meaning. It's
yeah.
interesting, speaking of the spectator and the drama and the aggressiveness, there was a study done not too long ago that found that fan aggression was directly related to the amount of physical contact present in a sport. So irrespective of any cultural normative behavior aspects that the sport possess, just the physicality of the sport alone could predict fan aggressive behavior. So yelling, shouting, physical altercations. So the highest likelihood of fan aggression would be in MMA. And it literally goes in descending order. Most aggressive would follow, then next would be traditional boxing, football, rugby, hockey, basketball, etc. And all the way at the bottom would be something like maybe golf or something like that. So the question is like, is that a chicken egg situation? Because the sport on its own in a vacuum is neutral. So there must be something about the sport that's attracting that type of fan, or it's generating that type of reaction in otherwise neutral fans. And so obviously probably a little bit of both going on.
Yeah, and I like that you specified that there's sort of a range of aggression and violence in sports, and some people find those fighting ones to be too violent but some people really thrive on that. And from my own experience participating, I definitely tended towards the less violent ones. I didn't really understand at that age that like you have to use your body and you have to be physical with people. And I think that's lost on a lot of people as well. I don't think my experience participating in sports is unique that way, where especially if you get some people who are more physical competing with people who are less physical, these people who don't like pushing or fighting for a position, these people are just, this is not their thing.
That's a point I try to emphasize for my students who are going to be PE teachers, is that we might be alienating a large percentage of our PE participants by having overly aggressive sports, or maybe even just sports in general. Perhaps physical education is not the ideal setting for the team sports model. Maybe team sports that can be achieved through rec leagues, city leagues, club leagues, and obviously intercollegiate and interscholastic athletics. And so that's an issue that I see in physical education, is overly using sports, especially sports that are aggressive in nature.
I think the classic one that people still have like PTSD from is like dodgeball when you get when you get the whole class together. So you just have these, kids maybe that are athletes, maybe they matured faster and they're in with kids that maybe haven't even thrown a ball very much in their lives. And, you just,
Totally.
but I wonder if having some physical competency, some sort of comfort with this aggression is just something that you should instill in everyone. And maybe that's part of teaching then, is to get people into the right competitions, the right categories that they're comfortable in learning and not being traumatized.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great observation, and it asks great questions. So, who are we self-selecting aggressive sports? The bigger, stronger, faster people are probably selecting what I would call the power sports, like football and basketball. There's a term we use in physical education called physical literacy, and essentially it's the goal of physical education to develop physically literate individuals. So having knowledge and capacity and interest to explore a range of movement skills and competencies, starting with just mobility, locomotion, body manipulation, then extending that to object manipulation, and then doing so maybe in an open environment. And that's what team sports might look like. So I do think it's important that physical education introduces a wide variety of movement contexts and movement environments. And then from there, students and athletes self-select what sports or activities they're interested in. I think that this country, United States, is so dominant in basketball because we as a country value basketball. If you look at the sports that attract the most national attention, you've got football, basketball, baseball, hockey, soccer. Those are really our biggest sports. So because those sports attract the most attention, they also have the highest capacity for paying professional athletes. And I think our best athletes gravitate to those sports to pursue it for professional financial reasons. So when you look at other countries that value other sports, they're more dominant in those aspects. They're more dominant in those sports and less dominant in others. So I do think the media plays a role in this. When you look at SportsCenter or other wide broadcast television program that's promoting sports and encouraging participation in sports, the highlights they show are always power-based, right? They never show a nice fundamental chest pass leading to a layup. They're showing half-court shots and dunks. They're showing home runs, big hits that knocks off the player's helmet. So we're kind of fed that peak performance in these sports are related to power and strength and speed, when of course other sports possess the capacity to be dazzling in other ways that aren't necessarily linked to power. And so my fear as a person that trains physical educators is that we're overly pursuing competency and success in sport, and students start to identify themselves as being skilled or unskilled just in a small area of physical competencies like speed, jumping, strength, and not recognizing that they possess other physical competencies and skills that are simply less promoted. So again, that's why there's a variety that needs to be provided to children at the grade school level, and it could be in compulsory physical education where a variety of movement skills and competencies are practiced and performed, so students have basically a bigger menu of health and movement opportunities they can choose from as they age into adulthood. Even activities that are completely personal and individual, like yoga, meditation, hiking, weight training, aquatics, and dance. There's not even a team component associated with those activities. But I do worry that students that are not good at PE, I'm using air quotes for people listening, that aren't good at PE, they start to categorize themselves, and it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy that they're not fit, they're not physically active, they're not physically literate, and so they're not healthy. And that's no good. We want students having the self-efficacy to pursue health in whatever form health might look like. And it might be sports, but most likely it's not. It's not going to be sports.
Yeah, that reminds me of like the Moneyball aspect of sports now, where you can use more quantitative analysis to see to gauge people's performance rather than, like you said, these dazzling power plays where people really key in on it, and people get overlooked. And you realize pretty quickly that we value many things in sports, but we still see the attention in those power skills, like you said.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting that the quantitative analysis has there's been a bit of a revolution to look at quantitative data and explore other variables of sporting performance in trying to analyze the effectiveness of an athlete, a player on a team. And we're finding some stats that we cared so much about, baseball, use baseball as an example, because it goes way back and we really romanticize the sport of baseball. Things like batting average. We overvalued that, obviously. The data suggested that batting average really doesn't tell you the whole story. And win-loss record for a pitcher is a really, really flawed statistic for determining the effectiveness of a pitcher, right? So you brought up a really, really good point with Moneyball and other quantitative statistics. It's actually restructuring the way that we think about sport performance and what good stats are and what stats are misleading.
Yeah, so like we've been talking about, just finding more ways for people to think about themselves in sports and engage. And a statistic I read is that 75% or 70% of kids drop organized sports by the time they're 13 years old. I suppose a lot of that's because we put up a lot of attention and a lot of resources into those elite athletes, and we don't think too much or as much about benefits that it can give everyone that's participating, even at all levels, I suppose. And then, so to go with that, I'd like to move the conversation to how do we find places for everyone to participate, find a niche that they can grow and learn.
I love that question because I've probably bashed sports a lot in this conversation, talking about how it's an avenue for poor social behavior. And the truth is, I'm pro sports. I'm into it. I think that it can be a very, very positive influence individually and have community value. So I do want people participating in sport. And there's lots of different ways you can participate in sports. There's rec leagues, which tend to be less competitive, club leagues, which tend to be really competitive, and then you've got interscholastic school organized leagues. And the school leagues, there's something interesting that's going on. It's been going on for a while and it troubles me. Let me just use North Texas as an example. It's where I'm from. I lived there for a while. North Texas has a handful of really, really dominant athletics programs in their high school districts. And those districts reside in communities which have had experienced a ton of population growth in the past 15, 20, 25 years. So towns have grown into developed cities with hundreds of thousands of people, yet the community is voting not to add high schools to that community. So the same number of high schools exist there in a town of 200,000 as existed there when it was a town of 65,000. Why would you do that? Well, the high school numbers grow, more athletes are siloed, and that school can develop a really, really incredible athletics program. Good for them. They're winning state championships and they're competing at a high level. And a lot of those athletes that are in athletics are going on to Division 1 and 2 and 3 college programs. So really good for them. But if we believe that participation in sport is a good thing, why wouldn't we want to build more high schools so more people can have that same experience? It might mean your team isn't going to win as many state championships, but it means more kids and more youth in the community are experiencing and participating and growing with the social components of being a teammate and the individual responsibility of pursuing goals and having an organized outlet through which to have mentorship and leadership and all the good things that come with sport. But it goes beyond that too, because what would a second high school in that town mean? It would mean another band. It would mean another choir. It would mean another cheerleading squad and so forth. It would just double all of the extracurricular opportunities that those students could have that they could also put in their college applications and their resumes to try to advance themselves. So that's just another example of pursuing winning and sport dominance instead of the other things in sport that they could be pursuing. So that's kind of greedy, right? That's the community's been greedy and it's been selfish and it's trying to hog all the marbles so that they can get their state championship bumper sticker every year. So that's a gripe of mine. But then rec leagues and club leagues, obviously club leagues are very difficult because there's a barrier for entry. There's costs, there's travel costs, equipment costs. And that's why I think the school, the educational institution is ideal for it because they've got budgeted in the resource athletics money there for kids to not have to buy their own equipment and whatnot. So the club sports, it's just such a large barrier for entry that it's really not practical. Although club sports, if you can participate, that tends to be the clearest line to scholarship opportunities for participants. And then in rec leagues, it's a much lower bar for entry. It's much more affordable. Typically coaches are volunteer coaches, maybe even parents rotate who's going to run practices and games, things like that. So it's a much more casual sporting experience, but that doesn't mean it's a worse one, because typically in those rec leagues, things like social development and the psychomotor motor performance development are emphasized over winning. So that's a really great place for children to choose to participate if those are the elements that they value. Your question started with the statistic that a lot of students have burnt out or dropped out by age 13. And that's definitely a concern for me, again, because I think that participation is widely a positive thing. I use the word burnout intentionally because that's usually what happens. Sport has become a year-round thing. It used to be that there were seasons to sports. We've used baseball as an example. There was a baseball season. Well, now, especially if you're pursuing a position on a club team or wanting an athletic scholarship, there's fall league, summer league, spring ball. You never get out of it. It goes on forever. And that's true of lots of sports. The off season in football is basically the rest of the year. You're either in season or you're training for the next season. And I'm talking about junior high and high school level here. So it burns a lot of kids out. And maybe the thing that you were interested in when you started playing when you were 12 is no longer the thing you're interested in when you were 14 or 15 years old, because of the growth that you experience in those years. So I think that's a self-selected statistic. I think that a lot of students and youth just determine that they're no longer interested in that thing anymore. But I also think that we can burn kids out by having them overly involved. And then there's this concept of specialization. The belief, certainly in the 90s and early 2000s, was, hey, if my kid has an acumen or a skill set towards golf, we are going to just do golf, nothing but golf year round if we can, so that they develop those skills, so they get a scholarship and go so forth. We have now learned that that specialization actually slows down the development of other athletic skill sets. So long story short, the more sports you play, the widest variety, the more likely you are to develop the overall athleticism required to be a baller in one thing. They did this with medal winners from the Olympics. This was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 Olympics ago. So 12 years ago or something like that. They found that medal winners in the Olympics, on average, participated in as many as 8 sports growing up from their youth into college. They did everything, growing their variety, their movement literacy, their athletic and physical literacy. So I guess this is advice I'm giving to any parent or any person that's interested in sports and developing athleticism in themselves or their athletes, is encourage them to do everything and have non-competing seasons. Let them go from volleyball to track to softball to swimming, right? Let them have their distinct seasons, because keeping them and drilling down into one season year round in that specialization, it burns them out and it actually shuts off their psychomotor growth.
I read the book by David Epstein, Range, where he makes a really good case for that point. Where
have you read The Sports Gene?
Yeah, I read both of them. Yeah, they're
excellent.
both good. Yeah, and the Range was, especially, I thought he made a really good case for that, where maybe some very specific skills like golfing, you can just drill down and focus in, but yeah, most of the time it's good to develop that wide range of skills, almost like in teaching, teaching to the test versus teaching the fundamental skills, and then having them, develop sort of naturally and then understand the concepts, rather than just being able to do these narrow skills that you teach them quick, they learn quick, they seem like they're improving a lot, but they seem to hit that wall quicker because they don't have that base. A little bit more on the participation in spaces. So I think martial arts are kind of an interesting case where people start that at all different ages and they participate, but the way they sort is based on your experience, basically. And it's not even necessarily the time you spent with it, but they have this system of ranking where they say, okay, you have the skills now to go to the next rank. And then normally when you're training or competing, they only line you up with the people who they think are, at the same level. So you can be coming in as a 30-year-old, don't know anything about karate, and you'll be paired up with some 10-year-old kid with a white belt who knows just as much as you. And I think that's super interesting. And yeah, something definitely we're lacking sort of in our Western conception of sports. We do by age, which I think is good, but I think maybe we can fine tune it and do something better to get
Yeah,
people in.
I'm seeing that. I see that in tennis. There's rankings based on skill set, and perhaps that becomes the more prevailing cultural practice in sport. I think that's really, really great. It's an interesting model, and it makes sense.
And then, of course, for a lot of sports, there's weight classes as well. So even up to the professional level, and the fighting and weightlifting and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when I was
Uh,
teaching in Iowa, wrestling is a culturally relevant and meaningful sport in that state. And I had a lot of wrestlers as students, and they're student athletes, and they were dynamite students, and I could tell when they had important meets and matches coming up is because they would be doing everything they possibly could to lose weight, sweat it out and things like that. And it is really, really, it's really tough on the body to fluctuate in weight like that, and to dehydrate oneself like that. So I think I read about this, or maybe it was dictated to me by a colleague, that they're initiating new rules on how much weight can be lost and how rapidly. And I think this is going to start in the NCAA and trickle down into the high school ranks, where maybe at the start of a season, a competitive season, there is a weight class range that you'll be in, and you're not allowed to go below it. So it de-incentivizes that extraordinarily rapid weight loss, which can be unhealthy. I think that's a great thing. It might sound like some sort of governing agencies got their hand and they're manipulating the way the sport's being played. I think when safety is the priority, and certainly safety of youth is a priority, I'm all for changing the rules up a little bit. It's been very, very controversial in college football to have the new rules associated with the helmet becoming detached during the play, and also targeting, which is intentionally using your helmet or striking the helmet of an opposing player. And the penalties for targeting are very, very extreme. It's not just the 15 yards and the automatic first down. It's ejection from the game, and possibly ejection from the first half of the next game. So in college, you only get 12 games most seasons, unless you've got playoffs or a bowl game, something like that. You only get 12 games. So you're talking about losing an entire game, that's a huge percentage. So really, that's a very, very punitive rule. And it's been very, very controversial because it's difficult to enforce because it's very, very subjective. But at the end of the day, that rule exists for player safety. And I'm all for manipulating or even changing outright certain rules that we've had about sports that have existed for a long, long time in the pursuit of player safety.
Yeah, I think that really contrasts well our gamesmanship versus sportsmanship that we were talking about before, because the idea is to get people who are similar to compete against each other, and then people are gaming it to try and compete against people who are smaller than them.
Trying to create an advantage. And what are performance enhancing drugs like steroids? It's creating an advantage. So yeah, that's just another conversation, but around the same lines. Like, what can I do that's downright cheating or gamesmanship that's going to give me an advantage? So everything sort of exists on a spectrum.
Mhm. Do you want to talk a little bit about the gender aspect of sports as well? And then I know this is a huge political topic with the trans people in sports. I'll just tell you, my perspective is like, I don't even know why. Well, I know why, but I don't think this should be a political issue, because it should be an issue for people like you who determine the health of the sport and how to compete and how finding places for people to compete.
I'll give you maybe kind of a roundabout kind of answer, and I think my perspective will be sprinkled in there a little bit, and perhaps my opinions will be sprinkled in there. But I taught a class a couple of years ago, a master's level class for sports administrators. So future maybe head coaches or athletic directors, leaders and key decision makers at the high school level in sports, right? So not just a high school coach, but an administrative leader of athletics of high school. So those were the students. And the entire class was based upon inclusivity, and the gender question, of course, was a meaningful component of the class. And And I organized the class not really as an opportunity for me to voice my opinion and allow students to voice their opinions on what we, quote, ought to do about it, but just to inform them on the journalistic approaches to it, the social justice issues that are being reported on, and then what the current legislation was and what the legislation might be. So really just let's gather information. So I assigned numerous readings for the class that were just newspaper clippings or digital downloads of news stories across the country that were concerning the issue. So of course, within those journalistic outlets, you've got perspective, you've got public opinion, you've got legislation that's discussed. We talked about the current state's legislature and legislative policies surrounding the topics. And then we talked about the way that some of the social winds were blowing and what the political and policy winds were blowing, so that in 1 or 5 or 10 years, when they find themselves as an athletic director, they're well informed of the topic. And perhaps they might even be ahead of the movement so that they can use whatever legislative or educational policies to their advantage, so that they could be providing a more inclusive athletics experience for all of their students. There was also an element woven into it which explored students with disabilities as participants in athletics, whether they be cognitive or physical. And there are certain K through 12 athletics that rewarded teams and schools and school districts for facilitating and encouraging their participation. So almost a separate point structure which affected the standings in a district. So a team on paper, in theory, could be elevated up a position by being more inclusive. And so, of course, people have their opinion on that. Maybe it's right or wrong. Everyone's for their own opinion. But the point of the class, and I guess the point I'm trying to make right here, is there are districts out there and there are states out there that are trying things, exploring with some inclusive strategies. And I err on the side of let's be inclusive. I err on the side of let's be safe and not put children in physical harm. And it could be that a key difference in testosterone is putting a person in harm, especially with a sport with a lot of power, with a lot of physicality. I'll use wrestling as an example. A person with more testosterone and more muscle mass, even if they have the same body weight, they're putting their opponent at a disadvantage. So I do want student athletes to be in a place where they're free of harm outside of just the innate harm that could happen during sport. But I err on the side of inclusivity. And I think for me, I obtained my perspective just by keeping up with it and not reading the news that's on like Facebook or Twitter, but like reading respectable news outlets and how it's being determined, how the rules of participation are being determined. So I do think that we're moving towards a more inclusive environment in all aspects of the educational system, and that includes athletics programs. And I think that's a good thing, but I don't think it means we stop exploring it, stop researching it, and look at the consequences, good and bad, so that we can always manipulate it and amend the rules just like we're doing now. So if in the year 2023, we come to some firm ironclad determination on who can and can't participate in men's sports versus women's sports, well, I think that that would be a disservice to our own intellectual ability to adapt and evolve and grow as a social cultural entity within using sport. I think allowing it rather to grow and change with society's input is pretty important.
You brought up the people with disabilities and letting them compete, and that reminded me of that kind of a dubious character that Oscar Pistorius. But I thought the case was interesting because the guy's got spring for feet. Like most, you'd often think that that's illegal. You can't put springs on your feet. But they found, and then I saw where they did an analysis. They thought that he would probably have an advantage for things like over half a mile, where just the energy efficiency would make it so it's like, this is obviously unfair. Whereas he has a huge disadvantage getting off the blocks and doing some sprints. So they found that sort of middle distance that he ran was like, okay, this is reasonable. We can, fair. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. So they drill down on that, and they kind of, there's wheelchair basketball is a really, really entertaining, really valuable sport The way they determine fairness with wheelchair basketball is you're given a category, a number to indicate your quote level of disability. So a person, an able-bodied person like me, I would be a 5. Okay, I possess no disability. A person that's going to be a double amp, a significant injury to the spinal cord, real high up and limited mobility, they would be maybe a 0.5 or a 1. All right. So in wheelchair basketball, you cannot have, oh gosh, I hope I'm not wrong. I think it's 13. You cannot have, with your 5 players that you've got on the court, a number above 13. So you've got to get kind of strategic if you're the coach there, right? So you got to make that work. Everyone's either a 0.5 all the way up to a 5 or a 0.4 technically, because you wouldn't have an able-bodied person playing the sport in the sanctioned governed version of the sport. So you got to get kind of creative there too. Now, a player is going to be much more valuable. Here's where gamesmanship comes into play. Much more valuable the lower their number is. So if I'm a 2, but I can convince the people that determine your rank and your number, because before a tournament starts, you do have judges and referees that make a determination of what your number is. If I can convince them I'm really only 1.5, I just became a lot more valuable to my coach. You see what I'm saying? So again, you've got some gamesmanship and faking it a little bit. So it doesn't matter the sport or the level. Gamesmanship tends to permeate sports across the spectrum. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super interesting and a
Yeah.
good way to get, maybe not at like, I don't know if those kind of games and organizations will ever be, at the NBA, NFL level, because they're not going to be the elite athletes. But I think it's great to have those sort of organizations just to get as many
Oh my
people
gosh,
in
I
and
think it's
included.
so great. So yeah, the Olympics and the Paralympics, they're played at the same places in the same venues. The Olympics goes first and they get a lot of national American attention, but in the exact same venues, the Paralympics follow. And so of course, Paralympians, they are the world's finest athletes. They just have a disability. So other countries, they have a much higher value and appreciation of the Paralympics than we do. And I think that they're the winners, those countries, because they're spectators to a really, really awesome sport. And for whatever reason, American culture just hasn't grown to appreciate it as much. But adapted sports and adapted athletes, they have the same dilemmas that able-bodied athletes have regarding using performance enhancement drugs, gamesmanship, sportsmanship, and all that. It's high level, high competitive, high stakes sports.
We've definitely talked a little bit about the health aspects of sports, but I want to dive into a little bit about start with the physical, then we'll move to the psychological, I guess, benefits of it, and just talk about maybe different sports and how they benefit you physically. I guess this is kind of a broad thing, but it's kind of an obvious thing, but I'm sure you can glean some insight into what exactly is going on with sports and physical fitness.
I'll do my best. I did a study when I was getting my master's degree in Texas, looking at ballroom dance as a facilitator for physical activity in physical education students. So we wanted to sort of quantify the effectiveness of ballroom dance as perhaps something that kids could do to get physically fit. So we had students go through units of numerous sports: basketball, flag football, recess style games was one, and then also ballroom dance. And we found that ballroom dance elicited a higher step count average and a higher heart rate average than every single other sport. And that seems kind of baffling, right? But think about basketball. It's 5-on-5, it's full court. Other than the person with the ball in PE, when we're talking about 6th graders here, most of those kids aren't really engaged. They're walking up and down the court. They're not being passed the ball, maybe because they're less skilled. So team sports, when you've got skill disparity among the participants, they wind up being a place where the athletes and the skilled players are getting all of the attention, and they're getting all the benefit, and everyone else is getting none of the benefit. But ballroom dance was interesting because you've got a partner and you're engaged 100% of the time. There's no offense, defense, break period, or timeout. You're going the whole time. So that was really fascinating. We also got to see how all those other sports kind of ranked, and other studies have explored that as well. the team sports thing in PE, they tend to be among the worst activities in physical education if your goal is achieving the highest physical activity possible. Was your question what's happening physiologically during
No,
play?
no, that's a great answer. Just, yeah, just to talk about the physical benefits. And
Yeah.
that was going, and you answered my next question. That was going to be it. Like, what sports you think are better and worse for these sort of things in education?
Obviously, the physical benefits of sports are dependent upon the sport, obviously. So golf, there's not a ton of physical activity, but there can be a lot of walking. So that's why you see octogenarians playing the sport, right? It's a sport that you can do for a lifetime. Pickleball has kind of replaced tennis as a sport that you can do for a long, long time. Still a ton of physical activity, not as much ground to cover, so it's not as harmful, not as hard on the knees. So again, that's a sport that can be performed late into life. So I would say playing sports and really being physically active in general is sort of dependent upon your current physical fitness and conditioning and what your goal is. So pickup basketball for a 34-year-old like me is a great sport because I can pace myself. I can sprint, break a sweat, but also I'm fat and old now. I can take a couple plays off and just jog and not be totally pedal to the metal. So the sport, obviously, dependent on what the demands of the sport, some bodies are better for certain sports than others.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that. Yeah, there's sports that certainly don't exploit the weak link, I think,
Mm.
and like basketball. So you can take it a little bit easier and participate. You won't probably get the ball as much because you're not moving around as much. But I used to play in a soccer league with grad students all the way up to their parents, so people who were like 60 years old. And as long as you could have the basic skills of getting open, getting the ball and passing it, like you weren't, let's say, a weak link on the team. Everyone could participate. And I think there's definitely better and worse sports for that.
Yeah. And there's a reason soccer tends to be the sport that everyone starts with first. Youth soccer, talking about like little kid soccer, you've seen it before. 4-year-olds moving huge huddled masses. It's really cute, right? And it doesn't really look like soccer. It looks like a mess, but that's okay because soccer for 4-year-olds is really about physical activity, and it's developing the psychomotor skills and the object manipulation skills that are extremely fundamental and necessary for basically all other sports that they'll ever participate in. Soccer is, and the research would suggest this isn't my opinion, soccer is perhaps the best first sport for very young kids to play. And also, soccer is an invasion game. What I mean by invasion game is it's a game whereby you have and your team has territory that you're defending, and you're trying to penetrate your opponent's territory and score in it while defending your own, right? Like hockey, soccer, these football, basketball, lacrosse, these are invasion games, right? So soccer is at its core, extraordinarily simple. Score in that goal, don't let them score in this goal. And so there's not a ton of strategy that's necessary to play it as a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old. So that's kind of like the best, I'm using air quotes here, best sport to start your little kids out in is soccer, is because they're learning the fundamental strategy of invasion games, which are popular. They'll probably play them when they grow up, and really, really, really good for learning total body psychomotor control. Really, really good. I was talking earlier about people selecting the sports based upon their fitness and whatnot, like being able to play certain sports into old age, but not other sports into old age. Like you don't see 65-year-olds strapping on a helmet and playing football anymore, obviously. But I did this study. It was actually my dissertation, which is exploring age or the perception of age and how students in physical education thought that a teacher was a role model and knowledgeable of the sporting subject. And we looked at age as being the independent variable there. And tying up that study, I was exploring why that really mattered, why that information matters. And because age is invariably, hopefully, the only out group that we all ultimately become in group on, like the elderly, right? Hopefully. And physical education is a place where we're teaching holistic health and wellness and physical activity. And I think we do this, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby we get to a certain age and we think, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. That's not for me anymore. I don't lift weights anymore. I'll do this. I have to do this because I can't do this. And I think that that attitude is harmful. And I also think applying that in practice and becoming more sedentary and narrowing the amount of physical activity and movement proficiency that you have and you participate in, I think that actually accelerates the aging process, right? Uh, so I think that it's really, really important as we get older to stay in contact with movement, with sport, with physical activity in some capacity, because the moment people stop viewing themselves as healthy, as far as their attitude and their perception, that's when they start physically putting into practice their personal beliefs, and then health will totally plummet. Got to stick with it. Got to keep moving.
You see that manifest in a lot of different ways through is focusing on the elite aspect of sports that we talked about earlier. I know a lot of training that I did like in high school, and that they would look to the elite athletes and see how they were training and apply that to younger kids, and it just seemed like the completely wrong thing to do. I heard a quote from somebody, probably maybe it was Epstein, that you should be training kids the way, not the way professional athletes train, but the way they trained as kids, because it's very different. Yeah, I'm a pretty big runner, so I've seen a lot of injuries from overexertion and burnout and running, and that should be a lifelong sport, but so many times people get hurt and just
Absolutely.
done.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, that I always ask my students, especially I taught this strength and conditioning class a couple of years ago, and I asked my students, should kids lift weights? And you get a variety of different answers there. Like, well, how old are we talking? I say 16 years old. They say, yeah, they're 16-year-old can lift weights. So what about 12? It's kind of a tepid response. I said 8. And right around the time I get to 7 or 8, they're like, no, you shouldn't lift weights. I said, okay, well, what about what is resistance training, right? And I'm giving you the reduced version here, but this is really like a whole long conversation we're having, whereby I lead them to realize something that they already knew, which is kids playing is resistance training. You know, a kid climbing a rope ladder mimics a chin up, right? It's like a modified chin up. Kids, you know, a 5-year-old heaving a basketball from the free throw line is no different than you or I heaving a medicine ball. It's resistance to them. So I encourage my students to think about resistance training as just moving your body against resistance, and it doesn't have to be weights. So exercise and resistance training for youngsters and youth can take place, and it's safer when it's in the form of play. It really wouldn't be appropriate to have a strength training protocol for a 7-year-old, obviously, for like 1,000 reasons, right? But not to shy away from introducing and encouraging resistance movement for kids. You know, kids playing hopscotch, hopping on one leg, that's resistance, right? Moving your body against resistance. That's what play is. So like you said, and like Epstein said, I think in his book, is find a way to make the activity, the sport, the training, the practice, the PE game. If it's supposed to be exercise, you've got to disguise that exercise in something that looks like fun, something that looks like play. And then it tends to be, you get better buy-in, less burnout, and it's probably going to be safer, physically safer.
Seems like a challenge for educators like you to come up with well-rounded ways of doing that. I know, like as an adult, you want to get into weight training or something, and they'll give you a full body sort of routine, and you can more or less think that you're getting well-rounded athletic results. And I think that's probably important for kids too. You know, you don't want to make sure that they're focusing too much on developing one skill, but also one sort of like physical attribute as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a powerlifter in high school, and I started to get terrible pains in my anterior deltoids and pecs, and you know, in certain parts of my back, because I was so out of balance, focusing so much on the bench press. Well, your body works in perfect symmetry. You've got these opposite poles, right? So you've got the bicep, and the opposite pole to the bicep would be the tricep. One pulls while one shortens and tenses up, the other is lengthening. And so your entire body works like that: quadriceps, hamstrings, pectoralis, and rhomboids in your scapula back here. So everything's pushing and pulling in harmony. And so I was overemphasizing the bench press, the push muscles, the pecs, and the deltoids. I had wicked back pain. And so I had to work with an athletic trainer and a PT to balance that out. And I was 16 or 17 years old. So, you know, those concepts, those anatomical concepts weren't really clear to me. I learned through doing, anatomy. And I think that you hit the nail on the head that everything needs to be done in balance. Physically in the weight room, balancing things out. If you're going to do 10 sets on your quadriceps, you need to do 10 sets on your hamstrings and so forth. But also with the type of sports that we introduce our youth to. And I think the biggest example is individual sports and team sports. The mechanisms of performance and success and enjoyment in team sports is so different than individual sport. And it attracts different types of personalities. And I think it's really, really important, maybe for parents that are interested in their kids playing sports, that they're doing both, because it's a different social dynamic. It's a different personal and individual responsibility dynamic. Goals are different with the team than they are individually and so forth. So I think as far as the social and cognitive and interpersonal development that we want sport to provide, I don't think you can achieve it in fidelity unless you're participating in both individual and team sports.
Yeah, let's roll with that. The mental aspects and the social aspects. I read that kind of to contrast the stereotype of the dumb jock, that athletes actually tend to do better academically, and partly that's just the physiological aspect where getting exercise, you're probably sleeping better, but then also just general health marker or general mental health markers, just all of those seem to be better in athletes and people participating
Yeah.
in sports.
And I don't think that's a coincidence. Let's talk about junior high and high school sports as if they're, a net positive. Okay, we know that there's all sorts of issues and problems socially and whatnot that can occur through participating in sports. But let's talk about sport as if it's just, a mostly good thing, which it is. Being a member of athletics, being on a team means you have community. It means you probably have friendship. It means you have leadership. You've got someone other than your parents keeping an eye on you. If you're committed to your sport, you're probably not drinking and smoking cigarettes. You're probably not out all night at parties because you've got 6 a.m. practice. It's kind of keeping you organized and responsible. So naturally, that's a good place to be in to perform well academically. Playing football doesn't make you smarter. It certainly doesn't. But playing football and being committed to your team, being committed to yourself, probably does keep you from doing things that would be detrimental to your grades at some point. So absolutely, it's not a coincidence. It's not that the sport makes one smarter or the sport makes one do well on tests. It's almost through eliminating all those other harmful elements of childhood and the experience of being a youth growing up that I think benefits academic performance. And also most teams and certainly most schools and districts have minimum GPA requirements to participate. You could be put on academic probation, missing games. So hopefully you've got good leadership in schools and good leadership in coaching that are using the sport as an incentive to do well in school. There's a lot that's in play there that I think explains why athletes do better in school. But that's obviously yet another great reason, another great excuse to be a high school or junior high participant, or maybe nudge your kids that direction.
And the leadership aspect of it, I find interesting as well, especially if you, let's say high school, you join as a freshman and then you progress up through the years. I feel like most people, if they stick with it, you don't necessarily have to be the best, but just based on your experience and sticking with it, eventually you'll find yourself in that role of being a leader to the new athletes. And I think that's kind of rare in society, where we segment a lot by, we talked about putting people in competition with people who are like them, but also you do encounter these situations where you have these mentors and you have kids who are just a few years older, but they're going to be physically more mature. And then they kind of adopt this role of a role model as a teacher to the younger students, the younger kids. And I think that's something
it's kind of like having a big sister or a big brother, just by nature of being a sophomore on team and having senior leadership, right? That can be very, very positive, very, very beneficial. And of course, team captains, right? So the selection method for team captains is up to the coach. Lots of coaches, depending on the sport, will elect one or two or a handful of captains. Maybe it's voted on by their peers. Maybe it's a combination of both. So there's an opportunity there for coaches to influence who the peer leadership is going to be. So you've got leadership taking different forms. Just the inherent nature of leadership from seniority down to the younger ranks, right? The seniority tend to be leaders, and you've got captains among them. You might even have a junior level captain, sophomore level captain, etc. And then the coaching staff itself. So I do think it's a great place for a person to look towards mentorship and look towards leadership in multiple forms, through at their peers and at adult leaders in that capacity. So again, a variety, right? Variety is almost like the word of the conversation is providing leadership in a variety of different contexts as well. I coached a soccer team back in Arlington, and I had the team vote for captains. This was junior high students, so they were like 12, 13 years old. This is pretty common, I think. The team voted for their team captains to be the most skilled players. That's who they all kind of wrote on their index card, and that's who they thought they wanted to represent the team, was the best players on the team. But what we know is that's not necessarily the function of the team captain, right? So I did a thing where I would rotate captains in as well that had demonstrated good character, good leadership, good academic performance throughout the week. They were also, I didn't deny the team their vote. That would have been undercutting them. It would have, I didn't want to be an authoritarian of a coach. I wanted to be, be democratic in that process. So I kept the team awarded captains who weren't necessarily captain material in their head and hearts, but I also had a rotation of captains based upon criteria that I thought was valuable. And that, I thought that was a really good model. That worked well, at least for my group and my team that specific season. But I had one student who was, he wasn't the image of captain material. He wasn't on time for practices. In fact, he was quite the opposite. He was kind of in a gang a little bit. They were recruiting him. He was mixed up in drugs a little bit here or there. He was really close to being lost in life. And that, of course, is a concern for me. So one week I named him captain, even though he wasn't really captain material, and the entire team kind of recognized that. But being on the team, I think, was the only thing that was keeping him rooted in something that wasn't really, really detrimental to the rest of his life. So when I named him captain, he was surprised by that, and he was really honored by it. And I saw it change his attitude. I saw him become a little bit more dedicated to the team and his role in the team, and finding some identity. For the first time, he was finding identity in something that wasn't nonsense like gang involvement. And I think that was sort of a catalyst for getting his life straightened out, because at that point on, he did change the way he approached his life going through school and academics, and he didn't get further involved in gangs. So that was just sort of a gut feel I had, a little judgment call that I made that wound up being right. Could have easily gone the other way. So determining leadership is a very, very important decision for a coach, and whether or not that's going to be a democratic practice or autocratic, or if it's going to be fluid. I think that can sort of evolve with one's coaching philosophy as they grow through the career.
Yeah, I like that. I like that story a lot. I don't like the sort of rigid hierarchies that sometimes you feel in places, but if you cycle through different leadership roles, I think people feel more involved. They feel, more committed to that team and to that organization. I think that's probably really good. Can we contrast that? I know, so we talked a lot earlier about the focus on the elite performance and the top level athletes and getting them there. And then let's focus on the psychological part of that. I know a lot of student athletes, younger and younger, as the stakes get higher to get into these programs, these scholarships and things like that, they feel a lot of pressure to perform, and then the anxiety and stress that goes along with that. I don't know, I'm assuming that's probably not the way we want to go as a society, is to put more pressure on them, but maybe you get better performance from that. I don't know. I was just wondering about that phenomenon and your perspective.
It tends to be that the more psychological pressure that an athlete places on themselves, the worse they perform. Okay. You're better off being loose. It's funny. It's that simple. It's that simple. The more loose you are, loose doesn't mean uncommitted, uncommitted to performance. It just means not wearing psychological anxiety. That tends to be a performance detriment. It's also pretty important, or I should say it's pretty detrimental in terms of burnout and psychological fatigue. So the more pressure that's placed on a person, the less enjoyment they get from the sport. and the more likely they are to quit or drop out. I actually just did a study with a student of mine. We interviewed a soccer coach, a Division I athletics program, interviewed a couple players on the team, and then the coach, trying to observe for burnout. And this particular school had just made the jump from Division II to Division I. And what that means is the competition grows. There's more of a priority and emphasis placed on winning. The stakes are higher at Division I than they are Division II, for right or for wrong. That's just how it is. And so this study explored the burnout and psychological fatigue components as athletes made that jump. So when they went from D2, some of those athletes were like freshmen when they were D2. Now they're juniors and seniors at Z1, to see if anything changed as we moved across that line. And long story short is this: practices were harder, coaches were more stressed, there was more emphasis on performance and execution and victory, and players became more burnt out. They felt more pressure because there was more pressure. Now, of course, this is with college athletes, 18 to 22-year-olds. They're more acutely aware of the social and environmental and even economical structure that in which they're playing as athletes. 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds might not have that awareness. So that pressure might not really exist in their mindset. Also, there probably isn't too much pressure for victory. I remember being 11 and 10 and 12 years old. You lose a game and you're over it within an hour, right? You're on to the next thing. But the older we get and the more hours we commit to being an athlete, the more of our personal identity we've invested in that role. I see myself as a football player, as an athlete, as a volleyball player. And when your identity is tied to that thing that you're doing, that thing that you're doing is not working well for you, that's devastating. That's crushing. And that's why some people think I need to quit. The Friday Night Lights book, who wrote it? They made a movie about it in TV series where it was exploring football in a small West Texas town. And this town cared so much about high school football that the athletes who were 16 and 17 years old started to identify solely as football players for the entertainment value of the community. And my only purpose is to win so I can go to college, so I can be pro in football. Well, that's absurd. Like less than half of 1% of college football players or high school football players go on to play in college. And an even smaller percentage make it to the pros. So that's a dead end. So these kids who are worshiped as high school football gods at age 18, graduate high school. What are they? What are they now? They're no longer a football player. They've got no identity. Depression, anxiety, and being psychologically lost. That's what they had to overcome in the years that followed their high school performance. So again, I know you asked about pressure, but I do think that pressure, maybe it mirrors or maybe it follows identity. We put so much personal identity in a sport. To fail at it is to lose who you are a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of pressure comes from.
And you hear people talk about the importance of being self-motivated versus externally motivated.
Oh, yeah.
And I suppose, there's some, you want a little bit of both, I suppose, but let's talk a little bit about how people get motivated to do different things, whether you want them to be internally driven, and then whether that's through betterment or just through enjoyment, or just what do people find valuable that gets them participating, and how do you encourage that in kids especially?
I assume it would be similar to achievement in really any academic discipline or even profession, a little bit of external, a little bit of internal. I think that if pro athletes made $40,000 a year instead of $40 million a year, there would be a lot less emphasis on getting that level. So, right, that's an external motivation. A scholarship is an external motivation. I certainly think about club sports and how extraordinarily expensive they are and how many hours are committed to performing it. That parents view that as an investment. I'm investing this time and energy and money so that they get a scholarship, right? And so now the child, they're aware of that. They're not dumb. They can recognize it. And so now there's more pressure. So the more external the motivation, I think the higher the likelihood that pressure exists, and pressure in a negative sense. The more internal the motivation, is probably better for having a balanced psychological perspective on participating in the sport. I think golf is an interesting example because in golf, really at its core, you're not playing golf against an opponent. You're playing golf against the course. You're just trying to beat the course. And it just so happens other people are doing that at the exact same time. And then we compare at the end of the rounds, right? So I think that golf, until you, again, not talking about professional, right? Because once we're talking about pros with millions of dollars on the line, it's apples and oranges. But in youth and high school context, golf, I think, is a really individual sport whereby motivation is internal because you're battling, not another person. Weightlifting is similar. I was a powerlifter in high school, and my wife, she's a physical therapist. She works with CrossFitters and Olympic lifters, and we see that community is really, really tight with one another and supportive of one another. And everyone's just trying to do their athletic best, set a PR, personal record, hit a new max squat, a new max deadlift. It's really you versus what you did last week or last time. Whenever you have the team component, us versus them, that's when the motivations become a little less internalized and more externalized, because now there's a social component, there's a hierarchical component, and winning is done collectively, not individually. So the motivations change a little bit. In powerlifting, I've seen people try to set PRs for themselves, and everyone in the gymnasium or wherever the competition is being held, they stop down, they're clapping their hands, they're rooting you on, because that's you versus you, and that's pretty cool. So certain sports, they tend to be, at least at the top of my head from my point of view, they tend to be individual. Individual sports probably skew towards more internal motivation rather than team sports and external motivations. The higher the stakes, definitely the more gamesmanship, and definitely the more pressure too. So everything sort of moves fluidly along a spectrum there in terms of the function of motivation and the outcome orientation, meaning it was winning the outcome that we're aiming at, or was it the interpersonal or social development? And I think that's related too. Winning is external, an external motivation, whereas development would be internal.
I thought it was funny that you mentioned the coaching kids as an investment for later with scholarships and things. I listened to a Freakonomics podcast recently. They were talking about the long snapper and how I don't think anyone does this because they especially like, snapping the ball long distance, but it's such a specialized skill. And if you're good, you can get a scholarship and it can be very beneficial later. I just thought it was hilarious to see all the
Absolutely.
dynamics around that.
Yeah, most long snappers on average are like 5 years older than their NFL contemporaries, because you can play that position much longer because you're not getting beat around, and your body isn't taking as much wear and tear as other positions. So yeah, long snappers tend to be older, not like 45 older, but they do skew older than their contemporaries or teammates.
And then also, I got to ask about participation trophies as an external motivator. I know people people love to bash on them as like, there should be some hierarchy, winning and losing, and these sort of dynamics. And I don't know, personally, I never cared about them, but I don't know, maybe it's helpful for some people, maybe it devalues it for others. I don't know.
When I'm trying to think back to when I was 6 or 7 years old playing sports, I don't even know if I got, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I don't even remember. And I think that's the point I'm making. Kids don't, what is a little wooden participant? It doesn't mean anything to them anyways when they're 7 years old. They're on off doing their other things, playing. I don't think 7-year-olds are stewing over whether or not they won or they lost, whether or not they got a medal or not. If they do, I'm sure it's for a very brief amount of time because they have a short attention span. I really think the participation trophy argument was fabricated, and it's parents that are having the argument. Kids don't care. If you're in rec leagues, I don't care. Give kids medals, trophy, ribbons, whatever, because they don't care. So I really don't think kids care at all. So I'm not going to care on their behalf because they're not harmed one way or the other. At a certain point, though, now we're talking about 12, 13, 14-year-olds where victory is an objective, not the objective. Perhaps participation trophies, I don't know, I'll use air quotes again, water down the experience for the winners. it's funny that it's still like out there in the social ether, that argument, but I swear, I think it was really just fabricated, manufactured by parents that wanted to use the political social landscape as another fulcrum for another argument. It's another cultural war talking point. I don't think kids care, and I don't think it affects their development. But I should create a caveat here. That's my perspective. That's my point of view based on my opinion. I'm not an adolescent psychologist. Okay, so I wouldn't be the right person to give you the gospel truth on that. Just as a coach, as an athlete, and as a kinesiologist that does do research in the sporting world, I really don't think kids care.
Fair enough. That looks good to me. I like to end just by asking about where you think the field that you work in is going, kind of the exciting research, the exciting tendencies that you're seeing, what you do personally. Just, yeah, give us a view of the future of how you see things.
Well, I'll speak about physical education briefly a little bit, just because that's what a lot of my research is in. I think physical education, this is something that we can be encouraged about. I think that the academic discipline, the field of physical education, is marginalized. I think that there are obstacles and challenges that physical education needs to overcome. Now, here's cause for encouragement. I think that students who are being educated to be health educators and physical educators, they are coming out of their college prep programs better. We have better PE teachers now than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, et cetera. The PE that you and I experienced is antiquated. I'm very, very excited about the way PE is going to be taught in the future. So that's really, really encouraging. And we don't have the time to get into all of why that's such a good thing, but I assure you, it's a really, really good thing that our kids are going to learn more about being fit and being healthy and having social and cognitive and emotional development through physical education. That's going to be a net positive. That's going to be a big win for society. Looking at sport in educational context, I'm actually doing a study right now. It's sort of a retrospective on the effectiveness of an after-school program with a sporting soccer component. So back in Arlington, starting when I was an undergrad, we talked about this a moment ago, I was the head coach of a soccer team and I taught character development in an after-school program. That was like 10 to 15 years ago I started. Well, we've kept up with some of those participants, even had little reunions and things like that. And this study is going to be a look back on that program, the missions of that program, the coaching strategies, the coaching philosophies, the pedagogical methods and philosophies, and really the overall mission of that program to sort of assess it for its effectiveness. So we'll interview some of those students. We'll talk about the meaningfulness of being a participant in that program, what they learned and used from that program moving forward, and have them really just basically remark on it. So obviously it's going to be a qualitative interpretive study using interviews and focus groups. And I hope and I suspect that they will validate the presence and the utility of that program, because that was a school, like I said earlier, that had some pretty tough challenges it had to overcome. And I'm hoping that we learned that being a member of a team with leadership that cared about them really, really did matter, because I do think that that's what sport can do. I think that sport has the capacity to do something really, really special, which is give unification and direction and even purpose. Again, it's a double-edged sword, because a person can be so invested in something that's where their identity is, and your identity can be lost, right? Because sport can be taken away from you as well. But I do think that it can be a really, really special place where people can grow and develop, and even a sense of community, a sense of civility and citizenship can be the outcome of being an athlete in either an individual or team sport. So that's what I'm hoping my research, I hope it verifies that belief that I have. And if not, well, we'll just keep trying.
Okay, great. Yeah, a little retrospective analysis is always good, I think.
Yeah, sometimes it's important to look back so that you can look forward.
Great, that sounds good. I hope it goes well for you. Well, thanks very much for your time. This was great. I learned a lot, and you were insightful.
Well, I appreciate it a lot. I had a great time talking about it. And, it's funny, all these things that you talked about, all the topics, whether it's just the educational component, the psychological component, fan aggression, all that stuff. The truth is, these are all, 2-hour lectures, right? You could drill into all these things. You could take a graduate course on any one of those subjects alone. So yeah, we just got to skim the surface a little bit, but I love talking about it because sport in a lot of ways touches most of us in some capacity, even if you're not really involved.